This is The Secret Library, a podcast about writing and publishing books. I'm Caroline Donahue, a life coach who works with writers, and I'm here to tell you this is your year. It's time to stop waiting and start writing. This is episode 89. My guest this week is Danielle Lazarin, whose debut collection of short stories, Backtalk, is out now. Her fiction can be found in the Southern Review, Colorado Review, Indiana Review, Glimmer Train, 5 Chapters, Boston Review, and elsewhere. She's a graduate of Oberlin College's creative writing program and received her MFA from the University of Michigan. There, her stories and essays won Hopwood Awards. She's received grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts and the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance. She currently lives in her native New York, where she's raising her daughters and is currently working on a novel. I've never had, I don't think, such a great setup for an episode as I did on last week's episode, where Mary Laura Philpott shared books that she is reading and loving at the moment. And of course, Backtalk was on the list. And I was delighted to talk about how much I loved it last week. And now you get to follow that amazing intro up with a discussion with Danielle herself about her incredible book. So I know you're really going to enjoy this episode. If you listened to Mary Laura's advice last week and ran out and snatched the book up and started reading it, you're going to be especially happy to hear from her right away. And if not, I'm sure you're going to snatch up the book after listening to this conversation, which I tremendously enjoyed. So here we go with Danielle Lazarin. Hey there, just a quick reminder before we get into the episode that submissions are currently open for the I Wrote It Anyway anthology. You can learn more about the anthology itself and how to submit your piece for consideration in the collection at iwroteItanyway.com. All right, now let's get on with the show. Hey, Danielle, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on because we don't get to talk about short stories as often as we get to talk about novels. And I think I love short stories. I mean, I think about careers that were launched with short stories like Jhumpa Lahiri, and, you know, that just took off. And it seems to be unusual to find them nowadays. And I'm wondering about your experience writing a story and putting stories out into the world and how that's feeling for you in this time period.
I'm also a fan of having stories out in the world. Somebody was telling me the other day that they read the stories in between hiding out from their child in the bathroom. They needed like space. They were trying to get the kid to do something. And I was like, this is the perfect advertisement. She's like, I read them one at a time that way. I love that. I was like, yes, so much harder with a novel where you would be interrupted. It's really interesting to put a collection of stories together for many reasons. I mean, one is that it, you know, for me personally, it represents a really long period in my life where I've done other things in between, including, you know, trying some novels that didn't quite make it through. So there's just, you know, like the length of time that it takes. But what's lovely about stories is you get to like work them over and over again, and then they're done in, you know, in a smaller time frame. And then you do, as you said, like put them out in the world. So there's like these little pauses when you're putting together a book of stories where you can really celebrate a story for what it is and the work that you've put into it. And then kind of put it aside for a little while. So that's been like a really fun and interesting experience to like look back on all that time in my life and see how they fit together. And how they came together eventually, even though a lot of them were started a really long time ago.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful because, you know, looking at the novel process, you're sort of inside a cave doing it for such a long time, and you don't get to sort of, people are always like, well, what are you doing in there?
Right.
You know, what's going on in there? And you're like, just give me a minute. Just give me a minute. It's going to take a little while.
Yeah, but where a minute's like months and months and months.
Months and years. And is anything, and everyone's like, is anything really going on in there?
Yeah.
With stories, you can say, well, here's one. Here you go. I'm going to go back in, and you can see a little bit about what I'm working on.
Yeah, it also gives you, I think one of the things, it's interesting because, I have an MFA and I actually have an undergrad degree in creative writing too. I always like to joke, like people are like, oh, like creative writing's not a practical degree. And I was like, yes, it is. I'm still doing it. I did it twice. And, we're trained on stories. And then so many people are then told once they leave those programs that they like need to write a novel, which is, that's a whole other conversation, but, they're very different skills. But at the same time, one of the things that's like so lovely and important about stories is that they allow you to do all this experimenting. Whereas in a novel, like you said, you're in this cave and you're in that cave with whatever point of view, whatever characters you've chosen, whatever plot. And sometimes you have to get through all of that before you decide it's not working or I need to change it. It's just a much larger scale. But stories allow you to play with voice and with time frame and all these things. And you get to just do a lot of those. And I think that's why MFA programs and workshops are great, because they force you to try all those things that hopefully down the line will help you see your strengths and weaknesses and also your abilities, what you are able to play with and what you can do.
No, it's true. And it is fascinating to me because this is sort of true across the board with MFA programs, it seems, is that you work on stories there, but then most people seem to want to write novels later.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've been through an MFA program, and I went to Michigan, and I loved it. It was great. And they were really great about being super practical with us. They were protective of us in terms of letting like agents and editors and all that stuff in. And once people came in, they would always kind of pull us aside and be like, they're going to say this, but like, you have to write what you want to write. And we were really encouraged to not seek agents until we knew what our actual project was. But it was also always told to us that like, if you have a story collection, have a novel idea in your back pocket, because the world of writing and the world of publishing are, two different things. And you have to work on a project that's true to you. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I've heard most of all, which at first felt a little like a wound and now feels like a victory, was like, wow, like you sold a short story collection, like nobody buys stories. Which is interesting. I was like, but it happened and it does happen. And there are different expectations for stories than for novels, but, you're not particularly told that they're a viable, product. I hate to call them a product, but yeah, we were always told to have novels somewhere hidden. And some people don't want to write novels. And some people, I think, actually always want to write novels. And then they're like stuck in the story structure and they feel really free once they get out of it. I think we see a lot of that too. People who like write an entire story collection in an MFA program and then never want to touch it again. I think maybe that's a little harder. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me. I mean, this seems to happen across academia. It's not just in MFAs. It's like, we're going to train you to do this one thing, but once you get out into the world, you're going to have to do this other thing. But
right. So we're not set up to do that. It's been 10 years since I've been in an MFA program. My impression is that they're getting a little bit more, they're figuring out ways to work novels into their structure. I think a couple of programs are more aware of that, which is great.
Yeah, it does seem to make sense to me, though. I don't understand why it would be. I mean, I know that it's, been said, and I've certainly seen people have this experience, but that selling a short story collection, when, like you said, they're so much easier to read and consume in our current life and our lifestyle. It's like, it's so nice. I was in reading your book, I was like, okay, I can have a complete experience of an entire narrative with a group of characters and then go to bed. And then I can wake up and read one, and it's like you can have these moments throughout your day. It seems so ideal in the way that we're used to consuming articles or things and we want the whole thing really quickly. It seems perfect for the modern reader. But
yeah, I like that you're comparing it to like the way that we consume these other media. Cause like the thing that I hear a lot about short stories is like, oh, well, short stories and like shorts. And I write some stuff that's like pretty short past few years, I've come back to that a little bit. Like, will people get into them because our attention spans are short? And it's like, it's not exactly that. I don't think that's what it is. I think, if anything, what's difficult about stories is they are so intense and they're tiny. And I think the more compressed something is, the harder or more intimidating it is sometimes for people to get into. I mean, if you look at like poetry, people are so intimidated by poetry, and like the words to page ratio is pretty small there. I think it's daunting for readers to think like, oh, I have to re-enter an experience every time. I mean, I'm a writer. I like suffering and like darkness and like hard things. So I'm like, oh, but sometimes like when you read something, it can be emotionally draining. You invest, and maybe that's just a lot for people. I understand the feeling, and I have it too, or sometimes you want to read a novel where you're like, I want to be like in this world, and I want to be absorbed in this world for however long it takes me to read the book and just like really be sucked in. I understand that. But yeah, of course I wish people would like see the merit in stories. And like, I also always say, like, if you have a story collection, you don't like the story you're in, you can like leave, you can turn the page and go to a different story, because hopefully a good story collection has variation in it, and has different stories that might speak to you, and you don't need to read every page of it.
Scandal.
I know it's very scandalous, but it's true.
But I think it is. You get to experience a lot of things, but it's true. You do sort of lift off into a story, and then you land at the end, and then you turn the page, and then there's a new lift off.
Yeah.
And yes, sometimes you do read a novel because you want to just completely escape where you are in that moment. But we present stories today on the show as an alternative for those of you who feel like you have no time and really want to read some good stories. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your stories, because I think from the standpoint of a lot of people listening, the process of writing stories, I think, is something that they're interested in, along with writing novels. And I think the process of writing, just because like with a novel, who you're writing about for a long time. So there's a difference in writing stories excuse me. There's a difference in writing stories from the point of view of the writer, and you're having to come up with new situations. I mean, you're responsible for more detail and more, and plus the pressure of every sentence, being so precious in a story. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of dreaming up these stories and a little bit more about where they came from, because I think it's really fascinating. You've talked a little bit about where it came from, but I want them to hear it from you.
Yeah. The stories are, like I said, they were written over a long period of time, but I think of them as being written in a few chunks of time. Like, I would say about half of them are from the early 2000s till, I know it's going to freak people out. I used to teach, and I would bring in like these stacks of my drafts for my students and be like, it would be like 15 drafts of a story. And I was like, and it isn't done. And I was like so excited to show them, and they were just completely horrified. But
they're all pale, like, oh God, it never ends.
I quit. And I was like, yeah, I know. So yeah, from like the early 2000s through graduate school. And I finished Michigan in 2007. And so there were those stories. And then, I was in Michigan for a little bit after school. I had a child, which definitely threw things off for a little bit. And then also because I had a child, I moved back home to New York to be closer to family and to kind of settle in. And then once I moved back to New York, and I had this like very small, lovely, but quite frankly, babies are pretty boring, person in my life, I started to gain steam on these other stories, and I was in theory working on a novel that was not working. So I kept kind of writing these stories as like little kind of cheats on that novel. And I think having a kid and moving back to New York and then working on something I wasn't really into really helped me write that second wave of stories. I was at just such a different point in my life. And so I had new experiences to mine. And also, like, when it feels like you're not working, I feel like that's a way that I often trick myself into getting stuff done. I've written a lot of projects by pretending that I'm not working on them. I don't know how you can like will yourself into doing that, but like work on something and then always be taking notes on that other thing. You're like, I shouldn't work on that now. So it was interesting once I like wrote that second wave of stories. I think because I did feel like older, and I had this child, and I always joke that like, you know, children are like nothing like the best reminder of like you're slowly marching toward death. Like, I used to think like, oh, I'll write a book and then I'll like have kids and do this, and it's like no, like it's all happening now. Nobody is like calling me, like begging me for a collection of short stories. I need to just get on it. So that was a really swift kick in the pants, a really bad reason to have children. You know, like don't have kids to like motivate your writing. But for me, it was really helpful to kind of like get myself into more disciplined habits that I didn't really have in my earlier life. So I think I was just like writing more consistently, and I was writing with a better focus than I think I did in my early days of writing. Some of that's life experience, and some of that is just like having less time and then using my time better. So yeah, a lot of those second wave of stories, and I don't think that many people will be able to tell which stories are earlier and which ones are later. I know.
I'm now trying to figure it out in my head.
Yes. And also to be fair, a lot of the early stories, like Hide and Seek was a story that was called The Women and the Children. That was my MFA application story. That story I started writing that story in like 2004, 2003. That story was so different and went through so many different revisions and wasn't in the collection for a while. And then it was one of the last, I think it might have actually been the last story I revised. So that story's had a really long life. And I just needed that time to be able to come back into that story and understand what I wanted it to be about, which is also the beauty of putting a collection together. You can put things aside and then decide what they are, or what you want them to be based on what the other stories around them are. Like I like the way in a story collection, like in Strong Ones, the stories speak to one another and help you see things in your work that you maybe didn't realize you were putting in there.
Yeah. Did any of them change as a result of the stories they were surrounded by? Did you end up editing because you're like, oh, because this one is in here, I want this to, or I see something differently than I did before?
Yeah. I mean, a few stories, I mean, not even necessarily changed so much, but like, for instance, The Holographic Soul was a story that was my first publication. I wrote that while I was in Michigan. And it's about two sisters who are very close, and they, one of them believes that they have psychic powers, kind of. Yeah. Really.
I love that one. I kept trying to figure out the trick. I was like, oh, maybe.
Yeah, it's really funny because when I wrote that story in workshop at Michigan, I can't remember. It was like very difficult for me to actually reveal the trick. It's something my sister and I used to do. I think I did eventually tell them, but I debated it because it was so ingrained in my like little girl part of my brain. It's like, don't tell them the trick. Don't tell them the trick. Just pretend that you're psychic. I told my daughter it actually a couple of weeks ago. I don't know how it came up, but
well, now she's going to carry on the tradition.
Exactly. Maybe that could be like a special reader prize. Like, I don't know. If you buy 5 copies of my book, I will tell you the psychic trick. You can amaze your friends and family. But you know, that story, when I wrote it, was so much about the relationship between the sisters. But the other part of that story is that their mother used to be a photojournalist and basically had stopped doing her work because it required travel and sometimes, you know, risky situations, but really long periods away from home, and had scaled back her life to have children and be home with them. And, you know, now did other kinds of photography work. And in returning to that story, I realized it was as much about like that mother as it was about those girls. And I think I couldn't have gotten there without obviously having become a mother myself, but also in writing other stories that were more deliberately about motherhood. There's a story called Looking for a Thief that's like very much about the experience of motherhood and having children, and like, you know, what the quote unquote dangers are about living a life as a parent. That story was half finished in Michigan. I didn't know what to do with it. So yeah, I think those earlier things that I had seeds for and I didn't really know what direction to take them in, coming more into my own as a person helped me return to the material and see an angle on it. That was probably there. I just wasn't quite old enough to draw it out. And then there's two stories that are connected, that are characters that are 20 years apart. There's a story called Spider Legs, and it focuses on a set of half siblings. They're they're not half siblings. Oh, see, I'm getting my characters all mixed up.
They maybe feel that way.
They do, yes. They have a strained relationship, to say the least. There's two older siblings that are very close, have always gotten into trouble, and then there's the younger child who feels a little out of it. Their parents are divorced. They visit their mother in Paris. So there's those characters, and then for years there's a throwaway line, not a throwaway line, but there's a line in there about how the father, who's since remarried and has a little girl, has a second chance family. So it's not throwaway, because I was actually always quite charmed by that line that I wrote. And then that became a whole other story. I just couldn't let go of that idea of somebody having the second chance at life, and then like what would happen. The story is told, Spider Legs is told from the perspective of Caitlin, who is 17. And so she sees it as like, oh, this is, the family he's given us up for. And then the story, which is called Second Chance Family, is told by Hope, who's the little girl in that first story. So she's also a daughter, and she feels like her family isn't enough as well. So those stories, I feel like, do a really nice job of bookending that family and the lives of that family, and kind of following up on that question.
A lot of that brings me to something I wanted to ask you about, which is that a lot of the buzz around this collection of stories is around the way you've chosen to portray women's experience. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to sort of read some of that buzz and then read the stories. And to me, I thought, but they feel so natural to me. Like, it didn't feel like, oh, I'm getting hit over the head with, oh my God, this is a totally different perspective. I felt like, yes, this is how we actually think.
Right.
And it was one of those reactions, sort of like, this is a weird parallel, but like seeing Wonder Woman, and when she's like, well, why can't I go in the meeting? And how idiotic a lot of the attitudes that we're pushed up against. And then as soon as we are presented with something that realizes like, oh yeah, this is actually what we have to do. And I'm wondering how much of that, I mean, you have talked about, like, I was thinking about these things very consciously as I wrote it, but I'm wondering how much was just you writing like, well, this is how the character actually feels, and I'm not going to censor it.
Yeah. I mean, it's been, I've had kind of the same reaction in a way that I'm like, I'm delighted that people think the stories are like pushing boundaries. I've always written realistic stories. So it's like, and stories that have been described as quiet, which used to bother me and now doesn't at all. Because they're not, they're not big stories, and I don't think anybody will come to them thinking that they are. But like you said, it's like, to me, I was just writing what I knew from my own experiences and what I know from the women who are around me. I do think there's like a little bit, in writing and in talking about why it is people are having the reaction that this is like a little bit, I can't even say like radical or whatever, or that it pushes boundaries. It's because I think a lot of these conversations are ones that women have with one another and behind closed doors. And I don't think it's because, I think it's for a few reasons. One is that we need more stories of women out in the world. There are certainly a lot of them that have been amazing, but they're often marginalized for various reasons, they're not mainstream. I mean, like all this stuff that's been happening with the Me Too movement and in like uncovering all these industries where just harassment and grossness is rampant. I mean, I think we all knew this, but I had this moment a couple of weeks ago where I turned to my husband and I was like, and like all these narratives that we've always been fed, which have always annoyed me, like they've all been written by these men and they've all been controlled by them. Like the story of like what a woman is like as a love interest or as a mother. I mean, I would say like all you need to know about like what the world thinks of women in 2018 is like, look at a commercial for a cleaning product. There's like still a woman who's like wearing heels, like happily sweeping up a mess of a child. It's nuts. Like, I think we haven't come as far as we think we have in terms of like a large narrative. And I think that's why my stories seem to like undermine that idea to some people, even though I think particularly when women read them, I think they'll recognize them as like, yes, this is like what lives are like. But there's nothing particularly large about the actions that these women take. And I've been thinking a lot about how, if anything, what a lot of the women do is like internalize these feelings, which is something that, I do. And I think that is a common thing for women to do, is to like think something or feel it and not act on it. A lot of times because we're not safe to do that, or because the attention we get from acting on something just causes too much trouble.
Yeah, I think a lot of things. I mean, especially what you were saying about the narratives controlled by men. I mean, I think, there's almost this dichotomy that's happened in entertainment and in books, and less so in books, I think, but
yeah,
there's more room for subtlety there. But particularly in entertainment, where you're like, these are the types of women that are available. And the one that really killed me, I can't remember which interview, I wish I could remember which one it was, but it was an actress that well-known who was told she was too old to play the love interest of somebody who was about the same age as her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's that kind of thing where you're just like, really? Really? I don't know.
And even if like if the women who play those roles are resisting it, you don't see it. What we get is the product. There's just like little things where, like what, the story called Floor Plans.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about actually.
There's, two things I wanted to write about in that story. I mean, one was divorce. I mean, to be really forthcoming, the story it's I think my most New York story. I mean, I had neighbors down the hall and I kind of like watched, I watched them splitting up. Not that I knew this for sure, but I could just tell by what was going on with the real estate. And I was like, oh, that apartment's going to go on the market. So it started in this really like kind of just kind of human curiosity place. But then I just started thinking about, what it's like to go through a divorce. I have not gone through one myself. I have a number of friends who have, with varying experiences. But so I wanted to write about that experience, which is just always a shitty experience, no matter how it happens. And I also wanted to write, well, actually there's three things in there. There's also, I won't give that third thing away, but there's, one of the things that's between that couple, Robin and Lev, is that they both decided they don't want kids. And I got a lot of pushback from people on that when I was writing and revising that story. Like, are you sure? Are you sure? And it was interesting to me because a lot of this, all my readers are women. And to get that pushback from women who are thinkers and who are feminists, and obviously some of it was just that I was not making that super clear on the page. And I needed to work on that, but that we're all like taught to question that really basic thing. Like, are you sure that he doesn't want kids? Are you sure that she doesn't want kids? Is this really how it is? That's such a small thing. I know plenty of people who don't want kids. It shouldn't be that scandalous, but somehow it becomes this like big sticking point for people. How difficult it is to accept that tiny little turn from what we see as normal. When if most of us look around, there are women all around us who don't want children or who don't want to get married. And that's just the start of it. That's like a very heteronormative place to even begin to talk about pushing the boundaries of these narratives.
Yeah, it's fascinating because that's true. We see that everywhere. But we're sort of trained to not expect to see it in stories. Like, oh, well, how are you going to, I mean, even in having conversations, like as I'm working on books, and with other writers, and it's like, well, how can you amp up the tension a little bit? It's like, oh, it would be so much more poignant if she had always wanted children and now it was too late and he didn't want them, or some sort of narrative that you're expecting rather than, actually, let's maybe do the story like real people would. Was
Where
something that felt very...
It's not a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt very reassuring to read that. I'm like, oh yeah, like this isn't like narrative construction. Nobody can see me doing air quotes, but of like the list of things you have to use to amp up the tension. It's like, no, we're actually going to do it like real people do it. And there will be plenty of drama in that alone. Yeah.
I get asked a lot about the mothers in my stories. And it's funny because like so many of them I wrote before I was a mother. I think my mother is also like very funny and sarcastic. And it's funny looking through. I was like, oh, I stole a bunch of lines from her. Like there's a first story. There's a line where she, like the mother who unfortunately in the first story has passed away, like wants to pinch the girl. My mother used to do that to us all the time. I think this is just like part of my family history. Like humor is like a certain kind of darkness and sarcasm that's like quite loving. But, for me, it was like super important to write mothers who like were very unapologetic about just like being actual people rather than like you said, like the narrative expects, wants us to just be like, oh, well, they're mothers, so they're like saintly and they like love their children above all else. Whereas like most of the mothers in my stories are like looking for a back door just because their kids are kids, and like that's sometimes how it is. So it was important for me to infuse that into those stories in particular. And then, like to kind of get those little things in there that I don't think I thought about that much when I was drafting the stories, but definitely in like revision, I was much more aware that that was something that I wanted my collection to do, was to kind of poke a little bit, maybe poke holes in that like commonly accepted narrative of like what a mother should be or what a woman should be.
Well, I think it's great encouragement for anyone listening who's writing and feels like they have to do something a certain way, even if they feel like the way the book is talking to them is that it would go a different way. So don't give up on it is what I would say.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, you get like, when I was in graduate school, I feel like I got a lot of like, oh my God, is this woman about to walk into danger? And I would get that a lot. And I was like, she's not walking into danger. She's doing whatever. And, I would think like, oh, that's just what people want the story to be. They think a woman's going to get murdered or whatever when I talk about this kind of story. But, you also have to be aware that sometimes it is that your writing is not quite making that clear. So I think sometimes when you get feedback from people, like the instinct is to be like, well, that's not working, so check it. But for me, it was always like, that's not working. And I would be like, F you, like that has to work. And I would make sure to keep it in and make sure that it worked. I think sometimes when we get a lot of feedback, our tendency is to like be so afraid about the fact that we're told that it's not quite there that we just like scrap it. Whereas it also can highlight the things that are really important to make work. And so if it's bothering a lot of people, that's probably a sign that like you should look into that and maybe use it in a way that like will eventually work to the effect that you want it to.
Yeah. And I find that also if people in a critique situation get really fired up, it's because they care.
Mm-hmm.
If you're like, could you read this? And they're like, oh my God, but this part is not working for me. It means, if people don't care, they're like, yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, they don't even notice. And you're like, what about that line? This moment that you think is so important and nobody even notices it. Yeah, it's also like, it's such a for me, it was just such a litmus test of like what mattered to me in the stories. It took me a while to develop that, like to not just like literally listen to what people's suggestions were, but to like where their attention was drawn, and then think like, well, do I want the story to draw so much attention to it? Sometimes it's just like, oh, that's too much attention on this thing that actually doesn't matter as much. So maybe like that does need to come out, or be like, have, the dial turned down a little bit.
Oh, that's great. I love that thought that you're just like, okay, I'm going to watch. It's like, it reminds me of those things where, you can look at a website, and I think they have those things that show like where your eyeball goes.
Oh, I've not seen that.
I think they can do that. I think
crazy,
they're doing it all the time. I don't know. Maybe I'm just paranoid.
Yeah.
Idea of like, okay, you line up a thing so that they know where your eye goes, so that they know they want to put things in that place because you're naturally going to look there. And it's sort of the same way with the story. Like, oh, if you're really paying attention to that character, maybe I should, get them a little bit less technicolor so that you look where I want you to look.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's, I don't know. There's so many lines in there that stuck out to me. The one I think that stuck with me, because you've done so well in some of the stories, this sort of adolescent or teenage girl perspective, which I challenge a woman listening who was a teenager once, which we all were, not to have strong feelings from that period of her life.
Oh yeah.
But the one where I believe his name was George, he puts his cell phone number into her phone and just says, "You'll call." I was so incensed. And then, they do get together later. So you have to assume she did call. And I'm like, oh, don't call, girl, don't.
That's funny because I always think of him as such a nice boy, but
he is later.
That, I'm like,
he is. And I'm just, that was surprising to me too. I was like waiting for, that was the thing that I loved about these stories is you're sort of in some ways, you see your own conditioning. Like you see what the situation sets up, like the couple getting divorced, and you're sort of expecting it to be this sort of bloodbath, and to see people have sort of an adult way of handling things is more fascinating to watch, because I think the other alternative we could all write ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I love that idea that you like see your own conditioning. I mean, writing these stories taught me about like so much of my own conditioning, and starting to talk about them, like, like the phrase domestic or quiet used to make me so angry. And I think it's still like, it doesn't make me angry to have my stories called domestic, because I've started to think about it more clearly. But it makes me angry that so many people think domestic stories don't matter, that's a way of dismissing a story.
Right.
When for me, it's just like, it's the space that a story happens in. And that's the space that like lots of lives, not only women's lives, like everybody has a place they go to at the end of the day. Everybody has family, whether you are close to them or not, whether they're involved in your life. Like these are all entrapments we can't get out of, or entanglements. Entrapments maybe too strong. That was maybe projecting for some people who need that kind of projection, but
right.
Like it's there. And yeah, like the teenage girl stories, there's a bunch of them that I was basically like, I mean, earlier I was talking about how like, the way to write something is to try not to write it. Like, there's just like, there's a number of those stories where I'm like, oh God, I'm not writing another teenage girl story, am I? And I tried not to. And then like later I would be so annoyed, because why should I not write that story? Like those are good stories. Those are important stories. Those are experiences that a lot of us have had and that are worth examining. And those stories are often the ones that come out the quickest and like the most fully formed for me, and that I understand a lot. And I became angry about the fact that I was resisting telling stories that were mine. Like that's ridiculous. That's like a example of like how freaking deep the patriarchy is embedded in all of us, that I was just like, oh no, I shouldn't tell this story. And I'm really glad that I pushed myself past that to tell those stories.
Yeah. I think it's there's just so much that you can
keep asking questions about and keep thinking about. And I think it also brings up the idea of like, well, what is a story? What is a book supposed to do? Like, what do we expect it to do for the reader? And I think a lot of times there's this long standing tradition of like, well, we want to experience someone else's life. Like we want to go in and go into somebody else's head and somebody else's world. But at the same time, the reason it makes it resonant, that it makes it meaningful to us, is that we can relate to it. So why shouldn't it be a story that we can relate to even more than, somebody out on some grand adventure or somebody doing something completely different than what we would do, albeit in a human way that maybe we could understand?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like I write really realistic fiction, but I love to read not realistic fiction. Like a lot of my own reading is very different from the stuff that I write. And I just think there's always, and then sometimes in that you find recognition, right? Like there's always something. And I think we never, like the best books we don't go into looking for something, or we go in looking for something and then we come out with something entirely different. For me, like when I read a really good story or novel or essay, it's just like there's this kind of shock of recognition that changes something. So it's like you're not writing to find out something you already know. It's something you didn't realize that you knew, if that distinction makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think that's the point. If we were just going to read something that told us, it's like reading, VCR instructions when you already know how to program the VCR. Like, what's the point? But when you read a book and you're like, okay, I want to have this experience. And, oh, now I realize something about myself that I didn't realize was there, but it feels really true. And it feels like, how could I have not seen that before?
Right.
I think that's the most satisfying thing to find.
Yeah. And it's also like, it's super satisfying for me to hear readers, and hopefully this will still remain fun, pick up on things in stories that I wasn't super conscious of, that are there because they're there for them, because so much of writing is like, you write this thing and then you basically give it to a reader and you have no say in how they relate to it. But often there's like a space that they make with the story that has nothing to do with you, which is so amazing and lovely. Like they're having this experience with something that has distance from you. And they're bringing who they are to that. And that's just like between them and the story. And that's been a really cool experience to have.
Absolutely. Because you've spent so much time between you and the story,
Right.
Creating with that. But as someone reads it, they bring all of their own associations and there's a whole new kind of combination happening, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I can have my own neurotic interaction with the stories that hopefully are not how other people interact with them. They can't see the tears in some of those stories, hopefully.
Oh, well, maybe they will, and it'll feel really reassuring. I
mean,
hope so. Nobody's hurt by like empathy and understanding. And I think the other thing is, as this collection of stories is coming out in early February. We're coming off the second Women's March. So I can't think of anything better than to sit down with this collection of stories right after that and to really stay connected to women's experience as people are sort of celebrating that again, which is great. So one last question. So after all of our talk about stories, I do see in your bio that you are working on a novel, and I'm wondering how that is going in the wake of what must be an incredible amount of work to get this collection out in the world.
Well, it always depends on the day. Yesterday was not the greatest day. I did quit a little early and actually was reading a friend's story collection. I was like, so great. Which is a good break from work, is to read somebody else's work. It's always inspiring. It's going. One of the kind of ironic things about this book, which I began, I think I told you, right? So I was working on a novel which has like since died 100 times and lives in a drawer, and then I started writing these stories on the side as like a sneaky thing. And then when I was writing the stories, I started like sneaky writing this novel that I'm now working on. And so that was probably like my earliest notes are like 2010 or so. And the novel takes place in a like not too distant future to be determined, but the world is not a great place for women, I will say, is one of the premises of the novel. And like, it's been really strange to work on it these past couple of years, as many things I invented are becoming true. So it's kind of a weird time to be working on it. At the same time, I feel like really excited about working on something that feels relevant. I mean, I used to think like, oh, nobody's going to want to read a novel that's like, oh, things still suck for women. And people just are constantly saying like, oh, the world is fine. Like things are getting better, like the arc bends towards justice or whatever. And I think if anything, the doom and gloom of this novel has been supported by the past year or so, which also just sucks. Like I would rather.
It's sort of a mixed bag. You're like, well, I'm glad that this makes it really marketable, but I'm also really sad for the larger whole.
Yeah, it's like it's not the kind of relevancy I want to be writing into. But the other thing that the collection has helped me with the novel is like the novel is also about motherhood, and it's about choices that women make. And it's about remembering, which I think is something that shows up a lot in the stories. I always joke that like my default voice is always retrospective. And so like working on the stories also helped me kind of gather that central narrative for the novel and see thematically what it's about. So, tomorrow, hopefully it'll be going better than it was yesterday, but it's poking along, and I hope to have something a little more solid over the next couple of months, if I can keep my head in it.
Well, we'll think good thoughts for you.
Thank you.
Hope that happens. But yeah, we all have those days, and it'll come back around.
Yeah. Sometimes it's like in the course of a day, where in the morning I'm like, why am I doing this? And then 2 hours later, I'm like, I'm a genius,
Well, we'll hope that day comes back tomorrow.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for coming on and for talking with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening to the Secret Library podcast. The show is produced by me, Caroline Donahue, and Frederick Barry McWilliams Jr., my tireless audio engineer. To get show notes for this episode and all other episodes, please visit secretlibrarypodcast.com. To get updates, literary love, and notification when new episodes are posted, sign up there for Footnotes, my newsletter. And to learn about life coaching with me to work on building your writing life, visit carolinedonahue.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Gold stars to everybody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. We're so grateful. Until next time, happy reading.